Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. I want to continue on my deconversion story. This is part 6, I believe, where I'm going to talk about my time as a Christian education pastor. Now, where we left off, I was pretty much in probably one of the lower periods of my life. I'll have another one, but in this particular case, I was just kind of sort of coming out of that. I was, hanging out with some friends. We were having a good time. A lot more positive things were happening. I was starting to come out of the melees of grief. I was still having a lot of problems with the pastor of my home church. Here I am, a guy. I have a bachelor's degree. I have a master's degree, all set to go into the ministry. I've been given some bad advice. My first licensing interview in 1997 didn't go so well. So I kind of settled back, and I was starting to feel like, Ed, forget the ministry. You can write books with this, but go get another degree in something else and go do that. And there's times I wish I had done that, but I guess I wouldn't be in the position I am today to help all of you that are deconverting if I hadn't gone through some of the things that I go through. But something kind of happened. The guy that was giving me so much grief as the pastor of the church and kind of pushing me out of ministry decided to move on. Okay, he decided he was going to start a church farther up north in Michigan, and he left. And through the process of, picking a new pastor, a pastor that I had been friends with because we worked together on Junior Bible Quiz, all of a sudden, in the Michigan district, all of a sudden he becomes the pastor of the church. Now, his approach towards me was completely different. He says, "You're one of the most educated people in this room. You know the business of Christianity. You'd make a perfect Christian education director." He says, "I'm going to make you a Christian education director. We're going to work on you getting licensed to preach, and we're going to do this." Now, at the time, given my mental state, I would say that at that point I was like, "Oh, this woke up my nervous system." I would look at it now as my nervous system got this massive positive shot of positive emotions and just a really good vibe about things. And all of a sudden, I'm feeling really good. The depression is over. I'm moving through things. And whenever that kind of thing happens, people often say, "Oh, that was God." No, changing circumstances where things start to go right, I think affects all of us, but those I think with autism, and particularly me, I think it really pushed me forward into, okay, now I can do something. I had been substitute teaching, but I kind of shifted gears a little bit, started doing a few other things that were hourly, but the big thing was the church. Now I was given a lot of responsibilities, and basically, I'm going to call this, subtitle this episode, "How I Learned to Indoctrinate," but that's not what we called it at the time. I was learning how to disciple. I was learning how to teach, set up systems where people could be discipled in a system. The Assemblies of God is supposedly a congregational government for the most part. Each church kind of governs itself for the most part, although, there's different stages of that where the districts can be more or middle or later involved. It's really actually quite complicated for congregational government. But one of the things that happened is I suddenly found myself in charge of a lot of things. And this is probably the most successful time I have in the ministry, period. You'll notice I've never claimed to be a megachurch pastor because that was never true. But I will say that it was a pretty damn good second in command. In fact, I would describe the relationship between me and the new senior pastor as he was Captain Kirk and I was a combination of Scotty and Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock. I was a guy that would come up with the ideas to make his vision work and then basically engineer them, make them work, and keep them running. it worked out really well for both of us. And in the end, I was in charge of a lot of things. One of the things I was in charge of was Sunday school. I started off as a Sunday school superintendent, director. At the start of this, we had about 35 people attending Sunday school in about 8 classes. And by the time I got done, we had an average of 85 in our attendance, and we had 15 classes. So success there. I kept adding classes. One of the things was replication, where we stopped having solo teachers, which is a bad idea for a lot of reasons, but we put assistants in each of the children's classes, and that was your training ground to become teachers yourself. And when an assistant had done it for 3-6 months, we would maybe break them off if they were willing, and make them, it's a replication system that a lot of businesses and people use, and churches use it too. So I also had children's church under my belt, junior Bible quiz, for kids first grade through 6th, teen Bible quiz, 7th grade to 12th. I also was charged with creating my own Bible Institute. About a half year in, I started that. Basically, we're using the Assemblies of God curriculum, the correspondence curriculum, the Berean Institute, and we were basically taking those 11 courses, and I was teaching them on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the whole thing was a system, okay, that was designed to get people in church and keep them. The pastor had a good long-term vision for what he wanted. He didn't, unfortunately, stay long enough to, I think, see it fruition, because he wanted bigger challenges, and that's kind of what drove him away eventually. But I ended up seeing success in Sunday school. We watched our junior Bible quiz grow from 1 team to about 3 teams. We watched children's church during Sunday morning. It's going to be whatever it is, whatever parents bring their kids, fairly successful. Teen Bible quiz was probably the shaky part, but the teenagers had always been a problem in the church, but we kind of got them under control a little bit. And then finally, the Bible Institute. The Bible Institute, I probably would consider my crown jewel in my ministry. But everything up until that point is focused on children. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Children, now I wouldn't have put it this way. Children, I would have said something to the effect that children are very receptive to the gospel. They're very receptive to Jesus. They're very receptive to, hearing the truth. Now I would look at it as they're very naive. They don't have the mental capacity to really critically think about what you're telling them. And because evolution has kind of made children, particularly little children, kind of just they have a natural tendency to hear the warnings and obey the authority figures in their life, because it's a good survival trait. If kid's wandering too close to, the edge of a cliff, you say, "Hey, get away from there," and the kid gets away from there usually, especially if you say it in the right tone. And so that leads children to being very, very susceptible to any kind of indoctrination. That's religious, political, social. That's why I have a hard time with even social and political movements. It doesn't matter if you're left, right, or center, talking about kids and indoctrinating kids. Kids do not have the capacity to judge things rationally. You don't really get that until teenage years. That's why they become rebellious, because they start to challenge what you're saying to them. It's a first step in becoming an adult, is challenging what's told to you. And so that was the whole thing, focus on kids. We're getting new families in the church with kids, and we're putting them to work, and we're putting the older family members to work. And the Bible Institute was designed to teach my teachers and other people, Bible and skills and all that other stuff, so that when they moved into the classroom, they had a bigger, broader base of knowledge. And, the goal was, if they took all the 11 courses and did all the stuff, they could become, get a certificate of ministry, which would allow them to preach. And the idea of the pastor was to have them, preach in the community and whatever. And it really worked. The 2 years that I was involved with it, we watched the church grow from about, 40, 50 on Sunday morning to 120, eventually having a couple services because our sanctuary is pretty small. Sunday school growing. The Institute did really well. Once I had all the books, the draw was we'll buy the books and the materials for you. You just have to pay the tuition costs to take the class. And you think, well, that must have been a pretty good time financially for you. No, not at all. Okay, the big problem that I was running into is I have a family of 5. I'm living in my parents' home and with my mother, basically, because we're in the same town that I'm ministering in. We're helping pay with the bills. Um, did that a lot in my ministry, actually. And I was working overnight, 10 to 7, 10 at night to 7 in the morning at the world's largest brick and mortar. This is my first experience with them. And I was also putting in about 30 hours into the church in the afternoons. I mean, between Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. And I had Sundays off. That's back when they allowed you to pick your days off. And they don't necessarily do that anymore. They give you options. But I ended up, having Sundays and Mondays off. And Monday was really my only day off. Sunday I was busy wall to wall. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays I was either asleep, working at the church, or working overnight, and then I'd come home and collapse. And Fridays, Saturdays I didn't have church stuff, but often I would still have to do, my regular work. That was a day I'd kind of spend some time with the fam, or just veg, or try to recover. Monday was my day off. But I was a very busy man. I was working, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week at both things, but only getting paid for one. And so it finally came to a fact that I'm like, hey, I've kind of built my position here. We've watched this church grow, and and even the senior pastor was going, yeah, a lot of that's Ed. And, the funny thing about it was, I grew up in that church. The previous pastor had kind of badmouthed me a lot, and I think that kind of stayed with the deacon board because they wouldn't give me the time of day about paying me. And it was funny because the church financially was benefiting because we literally had doubled the income of the church. Nobody was giving me the time of day for the work that I was doing. And so in this process I had become licensed to preach. That's a little side story here because that pastor coached me on what to say and what to do during the interview. And I had to lie a couple of times because I didn't necessarily agree with the Assemblies of God doctrine at the time in a couple of spots that were key and pivotal, particularly the initial physical evidence doctrine. Didn't believe that, but I basically said I did. Danced around it. What was beginning to happen is here's where the deconversion stuff, I was beginning to realize that there was a political game to religion. This is where my interest in politics actually began. In fact, I would say if you've played the game of internal politics in a church, you know everything you need to know to run for office. I had somebody recently ask me if I should run for office or be a strategist for somebody, and I'm like, I've already done that game. I'll talk about that later when I get to my congregational church. But the big issue for me is I've learned everything I need to know about dealing with political things and masses of people in that church. And, people can be really, really, really political when it comes to money in particular. And I was to a point where I was realizing that there was this game to church, there was a game to denominationalism, there was a game to the Assemblies of God Michigan District, and I wasn't playing it as best I could. And so getting through the interview process to get that license to preach, that was just, to me, I'm like, okay, I just got to get my foot in the door, and then, whatever I believe I can just keep to the side and, preach Assemblies of God doctrine when I have to, and focus on the stuff I really want to deal with, which was Christian education, discipleship, that sort of thing. And in the end, though, that bothered me. It's like I hate playing this game. I mean, because you read the Bible and you kind of get this idealistic view of how the church should be. Okay, you read the Gospels and you read Acts, and the Assemblies of God is big on Acts, by the way, and you have this idealistic, hyper spiritualized thing of the church. And of course, we dealt with a lot of the spiritual gifts issues and things like that. I mean, I saw it all. I mean, probably my favorite story from that time is a woman literally convinced herself that she was pregnant to the point that she actually developed pregnancy symptoms, even though it wasn't possible for her to get pregnant anymore. Okay, I made a mistake in, tying my tubes or whatever. And she started to pray for it. And, God's given me a vision that I'm going to have a child. And some prophet came in, of course, and prayed over her and said that she was going to have a kid. And, she developed pregnancy symptoms, actually passed a pregnancy test, things like that. But her doctor's doing a physical exam and there's nothing there. And, but she held on to that right to the end, and that was one of the weirdest things I saw. But the more common mundane thing was that people were always jockeying for position, for influence, and it bothered me. It really bothered me. Now, the other thing that led to my deconversion, probably more properly, is the fact that in the Bible Institute I had to teach a course called Life of Christ. And we were using a harmony of the gospel, and I'm teaching from this thing, and I'm like, this isn't lining up. There's contradictory statements here, okay? And I had felt that way in Bible college when I took Life of Christ, but now that I was teaching it, I was trying to figure out ways to explain this to my students, because not all of my students were sold on the Assemblies of God and getting a certificate of ministry to them, and some of them were outside the church. They were in different churches, and they were coming in, just get the knowledge. And I don't know, I got to different parts like the resurrection, I got to the birth narratives. I also began to make the observation though, because, when I was taught in Bible college and all my life, we have 4 witnesses of the life of Jesus Christ. And the more I began to look at that, I said, well, that depends on what part of the life of Christ you're talking about. And then the more I got into like textual criticism and stuff like that, and learned about Mark and Q and, the synoptic problem and all these other things, I began to realize that, there's some stuff that's wrong here, big time wrong. And of course, I figure out ways to justify it and, teach the class, but I had to teach that class twice because I did a full cycle and then I did half a cycle the next year, and then I would move on myself to a different church, which will be the subject of the next video. But I began to have a lot of problems reconciling the gospel accounts, and the more I delved into it, the more I realized that there was more to this question than just, believe it, fake it till you make it kind of thing. You can't do that anymore. Once you pull the lid off the fact that the Gospels don't always agree with each other about the accounts, and in truth, they don't really have 2 or 3 witnesses. There are some events in the Scriptures that only have one witness. I mean, the birth narrative is a classic one. Only Luke talks about one of the birth narratives, and only Matthew talks about the Magi and King Herod. There's just all these holes. I mean, and the resurrection accounts vary very widely, and Mark doesn't really even have one. So it became how shall we say, a real bugaboo for me. I'm like, how can this be like the verbally inspired Word of God if you have all these issues? And that's when I began to, in my head, play around with certain issues. The thing about being in denominations, especially one as fundamentalist as the Assemblies of God, is you have to subscribe to the statement of faith. And you're not allowed to challenge that. You can work any way you want as long as you don't challenge the statement of faith. And the problem was, for me, I was challenging the first tenet of whether or not the Bible was even inspired or verbally inspired, and I began to look up different doctrines of inspiration, but I couldn't tell anybody that I really believed in different things because I could have my credentials removed. And this is probably the insidious part of being in the ministry when you're a denominational denominational pastor, particularly a fundamentalist pastor, you find yourself trapped. You're not allowed to think outside of what they tell you. But long story short, I ended up getting pretty disgruntled about the fact that I was putting in all this effort. My home church, the place I grew up, the people I loved, wouldn't give me a dime and just said, take that title of Christian education pastor. We appreciate the good work that you're doing. We'll do everything that we can to help you, but we're not going to give you a dime. And I'll be honest, after that board meeting, I went home pissed off. I was like, I've worked hard to create my position, and my senior pastor called me and said, I don't understand it. I says, dude, I'm pissed. And he says, I absolutely understand why. And so at that point, I began to look for churches to be a senior pastor of. And I also began to pursue my ordination. And that would lead me to my very first church, which I will talk about in the next video. I think the big takeaway for this video, though, is the understanding that ministers in a very fundamentalist, statement of faith thing get trapped, and that's a big thing from an indoctrination standpoint for me as a minister, because you're forced to stay in the narrow confines of whatever the denomination says. I was learning that the best way to indoctrinate is to grab hold of people that are young because they don't have the capacity to deal with it. We were also going after people that were poor. We're going to help them out. We're going to get them on their feet and so forth and so on. And you really are looking for the vulnerable, the people that are going through a hard time in their life. That's a perfect time to swoop in and tell them the gospel. And I look at it now, and it's like, no, you're being predatory. Okay, you're being very predatory about teaching ideology. And of course, the Life of Christ thing, a bunch of other things were happening, the disgruntled nature. And the next thing I know, I am applying to be the senior pastor of several of the churches. I'm looking for a position where I can either, they have a parsonage or they have the means to allow me to live. And I'm also, I'm telling my family that. My kids didn't really think much of it. They loved being here. They had their friends, of course. And looking back at it, I guess I really wish I hadn't moved at all. But, it's going to take me through a couple journeys in my life that'll really define me quite a bit. But that'll be it for this one. I just wanted to talk about my Christian education pastor days. It was probably the best time of my life in the ministry in certain respects. It got me out of depression, got me busy, but left me with more questions and a lot of disillusionment as to how things really worked. And, I began to lose my, like for a denomination I'd been a part of all my life. I just started to dislike them because once you pull back the curtain and see all the grime and dust and the grease and the corruption, quite frankly, you just don't have time for it. And so I was starting to change. It was beginning of the end. It just took me a long time. Well, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate every single one of you stopping by to listen to my story as I redo this for 2023. Next time we'll talk about my first ever church where I was a senior pastor. And I want to thank you all for stopping by, do the things that YouTubers do, like, share, subscribe. And I also want to say the celebration. We broke 1,000 subscribers. I want to thank every single one of you for that. It's still continuing to grow. Our biggest issue is watch hours. People ask me why the watch hours were down. I was out of the business for a year and a half, and I've only been back in for a short time. At current pace, we're going to get there, but the more subscribers, the more people watching the videos, watching them all the way to the end, the better. So thank you for doing that, and I appreciate it. So this is a 1,000 subscriber video. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hopefully this will be the beginning of something even bigger. Thanks, and I appreciate every single one of you. Live your best life. You only get one go around, and then it's over. So make sure it's the best one, and make sure it's a happy one. And I'll see you next time.